Welcome to Upthinking Finance, a podcast that offers a unique and discerning view of economics and financial planning. Here is your host, Emerson Fersch.
Welcome to another episode of Upthinking Finance. George Orwell, in his book Animal Farm, on the very last page says, quote, "The creatures outside looked from pig to man and from man to pig and from pig to man again, but already it was impossible to say which was which." Today's guest is a returning friend and associate of mine, Alex Krainer. He's a former hedge fund manager, futures trader, and market analyst. He's also an author and global commentator, and you can see his work on a lot of different platforms. And most importantly, he's a father of two. So coming to us today from the, I believe, beautiful Principality of Monaco. Alex, welcome back.
Thank you for having me, Emerson. Always good to join you, and greetings to your audience.
So real quick on the book note, I don't know if it's premature, but is it okay for you to talk a little bit about your next effort? I know you mentioned it yesterday when we chatted a little bit.
Oh, yeah. I've been working on a book about the Ukraine war because I've been paying very, very close attention to that since 2014, since the coup. And my usual practice is I copy paste all the articles, everything that comes out, and save it locally because I've seen so much stuff disappear into the memory hole. And anyway, the idea is to write as condensed an account of how this whole thing gestated, where it's coming from, why this war happened, and how. And I'm probably about 80% done. Teetering on the verge of the Third World War hasn't helped because every time you think you have the subject nailed down, something else happens, and then have to rework the prose a little bit. But it's getting there, and I think that I really hope that before the end of the year I will have finished the book.
Awesome. Well, that's great. So we'll look forward to that and make sure that everybody is aware of how to get it when you publish it. So on that note, I'm going to give you three choices here, and you tell me which best describes your view of the world. So, we're in 2025. We're 9 months into it. Last year, if I remember right, was the year that had the most recorded political elections ever in one year globally. And so here we are in September of 2025, almost into October now. And I've got three choices for you to describe how you see the world. First one would be the darkness before the dawn. The number two one would be the light at the end of the tunnel is a train. And the third one would be the light of the end of the tunnel is a train, following which will be the dawn. I kind of fall in the third camp, but I'm kind of curious to, if any of those kind of captures sort of the overall mood of things.
Well, I would go with one or with three. Okay, and I'm 50-50 between those two because I'm feeling pretty confident that we are, at the darkest moment before the dawn. What I don't know is whether the transition will be smooth or if it will be very bumpy. I have no way of knowing how things will evolve from here. So it's got to be one of those two. But I don't think that it's that the light at the end of the tunnel is the train, and then that's that.
See, we're starting this off on a positive note. That's good. So, and then let me ask you. Oh, and by the way, I think it's important. I was thinking about this before we jumped on, but one of the things I appreciate about you is, and this speaks to the whole trend following kind of mindset, which is, we all have ideas of what we think may happen, but the whole point of trend following is, you remove the human element because of the fact that, it's just an opinion that's anybody claiming to have all the answers, nobody has all the answers. Nobody really knows. And so I appreciate that, you always take a humble stance to these things and offer views based on your life experience and things you see. But also more importantly for me, is, you do make a lot of appearances, you speak a lot in a lot of different situations, but this isn't a open revenue stream. You're really doing it to try to help educate people versus having some kind of profit motive on the back end. And I think that's pretty rare. And I really appreciate that about you.
Oh, thank you, Emerson, for saying that. I think, you couldn't call this a prophet, but I would like, as you mentioned, I'm a father. I have two teenage boys, and I would prefer for them to have a good life rather than ending up like so many Ukrainian boys in a muddy ditch somewhere, ending their life too soon, and then me visiting them on a graveyard. And this is not a hyperbole. This is really happening. 1.7 million Ukrainian soldiers are dead or disappeared. And this danger is real. This war didn't just come as an act of God. It was contrived by people and groups who will never give up. And when they run out of the last Ukrainian, they will carry on to the last Pole, to the last German, to the last Croat, and on and on and on until they get what they want. And if they don't get it, they'll sooner set the world on fire than give up. And so all of this kind of started from a desire to make a contribution to preservation of peace. And then it kind of got a life of its own. And I'm in that river of life, just floating along with things as they go.
I remember, and this was kind of a, just a private conversation we had, but I do remember that time, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, 3 years ago, when you kind of made a decision to, take the leap, so to speak, because, you were getting asked to do a lot of things, and that took you out to that. I know one of the things that introduced me to a lot of other people that were in the same kind of page as you was that Bath conference in the UK. That was a really good one. In fact, I'm still friends with Melissa and a couple other people that were there. But no, you're right. There's a higher purpose to all this. And, I just appreciate that. So, I guess then let's talk about, because I had a couple regions here that I know really have an impact on what's going on my side of the Atlantic, and that's, what Russia. And I know you speak a lot about Russia and their role in things. And, so again, and getting back to the dawn, where do you see, some positives and what's going on in that regard?
Well, I think that the one of the most positive developments this year has been the beginnings of normalization of relations between Russia and the United States. And in this sense, I think that President Trump deserves full credit. With the start of the war in Ukraine in 2022, the Biden administration almost completely cut off all diplomatic relations with Russia, which are far and away the most important bilateral relationship in the world, because we're talking about two nuclear superpowers. And the fact that the United States and Russia are not talking again, they are on friendly terms, and they are beginning to cultivate friendly and constructive relationship, I think took us a huge leap back from the verge of a World War III.
All right. So thanks for that. Then let me ask you this. I mean, what about Europe? I guess the question is, would you say the EU's on life support? I mean, on one hand, our mutual friend that you introduced me to, Russell Napier, wrote recently, he's been talking continually about the problems of trying to unite, 20 plus economies with all differing strengths and interests under one economic policy. And then, of course, you got what, from at least I see, these cultural revolutions and pushback that's going on. What's going on over there? How do you see that?
I think that European Union is probably in its dying phase. The project failed because it has been mismanaged. It has been turned into something that wasn't the initial idea. it failed in many ways, but it has basically turned itself into a new version of the Soviet Union, with unelected bureaucracy dictating policy, aggressively seeking to curtail member nations' sovereignty, seeking to concentrate more and more power in the ruling central committee, the European Council. The Parliament is merely a debating venue where individual members of Parliament record their YouTube clips and then promote themselves in this way, but it has no legislative role other than rubber stamping what the European Commission enacts. So European Commission initiates laws and implements laws. And these laws very often come from secret lobbying groups, lobbying groups whose members were not allowed to know anything about, but they serve industry groups. So basically what you have is a form of creeping fascism, the union of corporate interest with the government interests. And European people are realizing that this is not what we signed up for. These people do not represent us. And so you have strengthening of sovereigntist movement in many countries now, maybe in all countries. And the European Union doesn't have a way of enforcing its diktat. It doesn't have a military. It doesn't have an army. It doesn't have a police force. It has to rely on domestic national militaries and police force. And up until now, the glue that held it together was the U.S. support through NATO. And now, Donald Trump is pretty much reneging on that. He doesn't want to have to do anything to do with it anymore. And I think that the leadership of the European Union and many of the countries like Germany, France, Great Britain are completely at a loss. They never had a plan B. They didn't have a contingency plan. They don't have an army. They don't have anything, any cards to play. And, they're reaching for censorship. They want to silence people. They want to cancel democracies in individual member nations. They're resorting to lawfare against their critics and people who challenge their power. But it's just a lot of bluster and noise. In the end, I don't see how they will prevail. And I think it's only a matter of time before this implodes, which means that their euro will go along with it. And Europe is going to have a very bumpy transition. But, unlike in the past, today there's an alternative to the ruling establishment, which, for 500 or 600 years, we had a Eurocentric global system. Europe was at the center of the world, as in terms of financial power, military power, political, diplomatic power, and so forth. And so if Europe lost direction, then it fell on itself. And we had, wars, world wars. We had horrible things happen. This time around, there's the center of gravity has moved eastward. And so the dominant powers today are Russia and China. And I think that in this sense, Russia and China will be able, at a given moment, to throw a lifeline to individual European countries if they choose to embrace multipolar integrations, the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS movement, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which makes a lot of sense for most countries in Europe, because the idea since the beginning, even in the early stages of the European project, the idea was to unite the continent from Lisbon to the Urals. So from the farthest western extent of the European continent all the way, including the European side of Russia. And then since the early 2000s, Vladimir Putin has been floating the idea of uniting the continent from Lisbon to Vladivostok. So again, from the Atlantic coast of Europe to the Pacific coast of Russia. So the whole Eurasian continent. And then since 2003, we have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a Chinese initiative. But more or less, it all amounts to the same thing. Changing the security architecture of the continent from a state of chronic and permanent warfare to the state of permanent peace, and then building a common market, infrastructure development, and basically raising the prosperity and wealth of the people who live here. So that's going to come, but it's going to require a political change in Europe, which, as things stand, will not be given peacefully.
So how real is the pushback? Again, we see these pictures of people marching all over the UK, particularly, I think London. I mean, is there tailwinds behind that? I mean, is that something that's real and permanent, or is it more just kind of a temporary uprising? And I guess you're there.
No, it's very, very real. The grievances of the population are very real and grave. And I'll just give you two examples from my own country, from Croatia, which is a member of the European Union. So I learned in just the last few days that the migration policy, which is the UN migration policy, which is also the EU migration policy, which was Biden administration migration policy. It's all the same. It's some kind of a globalist perversion. But here's what's happening in Croatia. We have become overrun by Nepalese and Indian migrants. Okay, that's now the largest minority living in Croatia. It used to be the Serbs who have been there for centuries. Now it's the Nepalese. Now there's been a change of policy, so the government said, okay, enough with the Nepalese. Now we go for the Filipinos. So for some reason, it shifted to the Philippines. But what's really happening on the ground is, this is not random poor Filipinos being completely desperate, so they come to Croatia to seek a better future. There's people who go there. There's people who have made business out of that. They go there and they recruit people to bring them back. And this is subsidized by the Croatian government. And here's how the program looks. If I run a business in Croatia, the government is subsidizing me with 600 euros a month to hire these immigrants. And these immigrants generally will work for something like 800 euros per month, when the average salary in Croatia is maybe north of 1,000 euros, about maybe 1,300 euros, I think is the average salary, if I'm not mistaken. So these migrants work for considerably less money, about 800 euros on average. And so if you pay somebody 800 euros and the government's giving you 600 of those euros, then you practically get a slave. It's 200 euros a month. You get a person full time. And this subsidy is not available to native-born Croatians. So Croatian people don't, I can't have a subsidy to hire a Croatian person. I only get it if I hire a migrant. So first, the wages are going down because of the migrants who work for 800 euros a month. And then these subsidies are paid by Croatian taxpayers. So imagine how betrayed the people feel when they see this. So they're jobless when they walk into a shop or somewhere. They come across these foreigners who don't even speak Croatian, who have taken their jobs and made those jobs unavailable to them and to their children and so forth. So it's people don't react by immediately throwing bombs and setting things on fire. but the grievance is there, and it's very, very serious. And then the second example is that they are implementing this UN, EU, whatever, WEF policy of destroying the farmers. So every few weeks, every few months, they invent some new reason, some new virus, bacteria, whatever. And then they immediately, the only remedy to anything that goes wrong is to immediately cull the livestock by tens of thousands. And so they are effectively emptying out massive swathes of Croatia's agricultural regions with arable, fertile land of farmers. Farmers are being uprooted and displaced. And we're losing food production, and it's reached such proportion that people are now actually becoming aware of the problem and realizing that at some point down the road we might not have food on our shelves. Why is this being done? So it's not just a grievance. There's a certain level of alarm rising among the people. And so what Croatian people see, the Italian people see, the French people see, the Dutch see, the Germans see, the Spanish people see, everybody sees the same thing. These are policies that are anti-human, that are destroying our communities. And I think that they can only be tolerated for so long before something goes wrong. And, people are trying to change the situation through through the institutions, through elections. But increasingly, elections are being canceled. We saw that in Slovakia, they attempted to assassinate the current prime minister, Robert Fico. In Romania, they disqualified the favorite, Calin Georgescu. The Romanians who wanted to elect him president were not able, so they were left with one choice, which is a globalist stooge. So that's what they have now. In France, they resorted to lawfare against the favorite Marine Le Pen of the Assemblée Nationale, which is another sovereigntist party. In Ukraine, in Hungary, they are actively trying to foment a color revolution to uproot Viktor Orban and his government. And now in the elections this month that happened in Germany, in one of the major regions there, Rhineland-Westphalia, the AfD party, which is now the strongest party in Germany, and they're also sovereigntist and anti-globalists. 7 of their candidates dropped dead in the space of 2 weeks, which is, in terms of, as far as probabilities go, is an impossibility. And no candidates of rival parties dropped dead. And so, if a peaceful revolution is made impossible, then only a violent revolution is a solution to the crisis. And I'm afraid that if the ruling establishment doesn't yield and back off, then we might be talking something about the French Revolution of the 1700s.
You made a comment earlier when we started about how I'm just going to call it the dark side. I mean, when I'm listening to what you're talking about, that they're not going to go willingly or quietly into the night. It doesn't seem like there's another alternative. So I'm kind of thinking of the options I gave you in the beginning, that the oncoming train followed by the dawn and the peace seems like a likelier scenario.
No, for Europe, absolutely yes.
Yeah,
I was talking about the United States.
Oh, okay.
I think that the United States have all kinds of different maneuvering space. You have power of the states. You have a democracy that's a lot more difficult to hack and cancel, and a lot more resilient. People are much less tolerant of nonsense. People are armed. You elect your sheriffs who are accountable to their local communities. So it's all quite different. And so I think that the United States might be able to make a peaceful transition, and even in terms of economic crisis that's going to follow along inevitably, it might be more of a soft landing rather than a depression that we are probably going to experience in Europe.
I listened to just what you're sharing. I had no idea about the people in Germany, and I think this is why these kind of conversations are important to share, because you can't, anybody that's still relying on Fox, CNN, or any other mainstream, BBC, Reuters, the list goes on and on. You can't. And I think a lot of people are aware of that, but I think there's some that still are kind of clinging to watching the nightly news to get information. And it's just, you're blinding yourself, because these things, even on Instagram and social media and things, you really got to glean through stuff to get to things that just resonate. And, I was going to jump to this later, but, when you talk about the dawn, and I know we've shared, there's a spiritual element to that, but I think, my wife and I were talking this morning that, at the end of the day, your truth really lies in the experiences that you've had, and then how you kind of see the world, and what resonates and what doesn't, what fits. And so it's a process. This is work. This isn't like it used to be, 5 years ago, right? Where, at least I'm, and you've been inquiring and looking at things longer, but to me, it was just, you kind of took things at face value, and, didn't really think about too much. At least I didn't. And now it's like, okay, I've gone the other side, I don't trust anybody. And then, so it's a process of filtering out resources that are generated from people that seem to have a pure motive, whether you agree with them or not, and then from there you start to take, okay, this resonates with what I'm seeing here. And it's work. It actually is work.
Yeah, it is work, because we're literally subjected to a blizzard of disinformation and psyops, particularly from the mainstream media. But then there's all kinds of think tanks. There are military units that, are all over the social media and so forth. So I think that the best defense against this is to, first of all, to always keep mindful of the broad context of everything that we're experiencing. And once you're aware of that, it's easier to discern who falls on which side of that fault line of this conflict. When I talk about the broad context, I'm talking about the conflict between two systems of governance, which they themselves tell us that this is what's going on. And once you understand this, you realize that many of the conflicts we experience in the world are different battles of the actually the same war, and that the war is between the legacy European colonialist system of governance, into which the United States has been co-opted, particularly through the 20th century, pretty much since the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank, but especially after World War II. And that I believe that Donald Trump is trying to disentangle the United States from this situation. But once we're aware of the fault lines and what the stakes in the battle are, you realize that many of these conflicts are the same thing, internal conflicts politically, and then the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East. They are generally different battles of the very same war, where the powers of the empire, the colonialist powers, are trying to subjugate absolutely everybody to their rule, and so they're using Ukraine to get at Russia and to try to regime change it, and then to partition it into balkanize it into small pieces. That they're using Israel to keep the Middle East destabilized and to try to destroy and regime change Iran. that they're using various allies in the Far East to try to do the same with China, because their model is one empire and everybody else is a vassal. And so once you're aware of that, then it's easier to understand who is who in all these wars. And it's also important to always keep in mind that no player, no nation in this is a monolith. So I often hear people talking like, oh, the United States this and the United States that. But it's not the United States. You have globalist forces in the United States, but you also have political forces that wish to genuinely return the United States to its Republican traditions, which, were exactly anti-imperialistic. The United States became a country as a rejection of the British imperialist system. So, of course, there are very strong political forces in the United States who want to get back to that. Because by rejecting the empire and declaring independence, the United States went from being colonies of the British Empire to becoming a superpower with unprecedented level of wealth and prosperity and technological advancement and military power and so forth. And so, of course, that this would be more desirable than becoming a vassal again to the British Empire.
No, it makes perfect sense. So you mentioned Trump, and there's a couple more things I want to get to in the time we have. And one is, one of the benefits I get of subscribing to the Trend Compass reports is we get your commentary, and I enjoy it. Some of it's finance related. Then you've got others that's, the geopolitical, insights. And, it seems like from what I've observed, your views of Trump kind of, went in with positive expectations at the election, kind of bottomed out around Qatar, if I'm reading right. And it's sort of, I don't want to say come full circle, but, it's been a bit of a journey in your perception. I'm wondering, is there a way to kind of snapshot that in a few minutes just to kind of explain?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I think
so
your view is a lot of what I hear on here. There's people on either extremes, but I think a lot of people are in the middle and just really aren't sure where things are going.
Well, as I just mentioned, there are certain fault lines in this conflict in the world. So the very important question is, which side of that fault line is Trump pulling towards? Is he in the globalist camp, in the camp of imperialism, or is he in the Republican camp, meaning not the Republican Party, but the American Republican traditions? It's back to its origin, 1776, right? And to me, it's quite clear that so far he has been decisively in the Republican camp, and that he genuinely does want to disentangle the United States from all these imperial misadventures that are draining American power and wealth and prosperity and military might and reputation as well around the world, and that he wants to focus on domestic improvements, reindustrialization of the country, bringing back manufacturing high-paying jobs, and improving the healthcare and education and so forth. So it's clear that he's trying to do that, but at the same time, we have to part with the illusion that he's an emperor, that he's just going to walk into the White House, snap his fingers, and then everything will be as he says. That's not the way it works. There's the Congress. Trump doesn't control the Congress. He has a very slim Republican majority, but a lot of these Republicans in his party are not loyal to him. And Trump has very often I heard him on a few occasions comment on various measures and initiatives and say, like, yeah, that's nice, but we don't have 60 votes in the Senate. We don't have 60 votes, so we can't do that. the tragic situation of the United States today is that Benjamin Netanyahu, the president of Israel, the prime minister of Israel, has greater degree of control over the United States Congress than the president that the American people elected to run the country. We've all seen, congressmen and congresswomen profess their devotion and support to Israel, no matter what. We've seen many of their offices that have Israeli flags with signs saying we support Israel. And when Benjamin Netanyahu comes to the U.S. Congress, it doesn't matter what he says. He could be reading the phone book and he'll get 50 standing ovations. And so I don't think it's right to blame everything on Trump, because there's a lot of things that are not going right, that don't seem to be going well at all. And then Trump himself does make a good deal of errors as well. But I think that it's going to take, we'll know the full measure of the man after the midterms next year. And until then, we're just going to have to try to do our best to read between the lines and to try to pay attention to what's actually going on and what's actually being done, as opposed to what Trump says. Because many of Trump's statements in press conferences, many of his tweets and posts on Truth Social are posted there and spoken for a particular audience. And then, everybody's hair gets on fire because they try to make out rhyme and reason behind every one of his statements. But it's more important to pay attention to what he's doing. I will repeat, the fact of him reaching out to Vladimir Putin, meeting with him in Alaska, improving the relations between the two superpowers is probably the most important thing he could have done on the foreign policy front, because that situation took us to the brink of World War III, which would have resulted in a nuclear holocaust. So the fact that we're now talking and that World War III is not on the menu quite yet, I think is fully credit to Donald Trump. And if he fails at everything else, but preserves world peace and prevents World War III, he's done well. And I also want to say that the sentiment is mutual on two sides, because I've read some posts by Kirill Dmitriev, who is the head of the sovereign investment fund in Russia and the chief advisor of Vladimir Putin for financial and economic matters. And he made a post a few days ago, maybe a week or two ago, saying that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin will prevent World War III from breaking out. Russians are generally very careful about the words that they use. Kirill Dmitriev didn't say that they should prevent World War III from taking place, that they could or they must or they would. He said that they will. And that tells me, because Kirill Dmitriev was in Alaska at the summit between Trump and Putin, what that tells me is that they have reached some kind of an understanding and that they are prioritizing this. And Trump has also, on various occasions, expressed his desire to rid the world of nuclear weapons, which tells me that he's sincere about this. So I am cautiously optimistic, but the key battle at the moment is still the internal political battle in the United States. He got the big beautiful bill over the line, which was very important. So that kind of is making things easier for him. That's boosted his power and support. But it's going to be the midterms because they need the 60 votes in the Senate, and we'll know then. Until then, we're going to be guessing a little bit. But at least the doomsday clock must have moved at least a couple of minutes back from midnight.
Well, that's positive. We'll put that in the coming dawn category. No, I appreciate that. I think that's a fair assessment. There's always extremes, but there's still. I mean, you made a comment. We were talking yesterday, I guess it was, about how long these entangled. It's not an easy. You talked about draining the swamp, and it hasn't been drained, and it probably got refilled a little bit over the last 4 years. And you've got, I saw something yesterday that Comey may get indicted here to a grand jury. So, these are things to look at. And then there was this disclosure that I can never pronounce her name, Tulsi Gabbard, but anyway, regarding Obama's role in the whole Russian gate. So this stuff's starting to get a little more mainstream run. And I guess to me, in my brain, a part of that is where the more that these things get exposure, the more it's going to be, hopefully, likelier to just start cleaning out a lot of the real problems. So got to end on some economics. I know I say this every time we talk. People forget that your real, I should say one of your foundational, talents and interests and vocations is in the economic realm. And so I'm going to give you, I started giving you some scenarios. I want to end giving you a couple and tell me which one you kind of align with. So there's sort of two views of global economics. This is my words, but it seems there's kind of two ways to look at what's going on. One is this is a phrase that a guy named Nick Murray, who's an advisor coach that's been around forever, started as a broker at EF Hutton back in the late 60s, talks about the apocalypse du jour, or in his words, there's always something to worry about approach. But in the end of the day, he'd say scoreboard, right? Scoreboard into this year is S&P up over 12.5%. NASDAQ, as the day of this recording, is up over 16. Japanese Nikkei 225 up over 16. UK, is it FTSE? Am I pronouncing that right? FTSE?
Yeah, FTSE.
Okay, FTSE 100, 11.73. The German DAX is up over 17%. And so you could say, regardless of all this stuff going on, bottom line is the market keeps going up. And then there's the other one, which would be, that the events that are going on, whether real or imagined, actually will matter at some point, which is kind of the camp I've been in for the last 3 years. And of course, the S&P keeps going up and up and up. And I think, we've talked to you, Amy and I, my partner, business partner, have talked about, we have this time it's different approach, but not necessarily to the extent that we're looking at an overhauled financial system, but more about the need to just hedge against risks that a lot of people can't see, including ourselves, and that would include commodity exposure to manage inflation risks. But I mean, where do you sit? If that's,
well, I think that we are in an advanced stage of something that I have been predicting pretty much since I think 2018 or 2019, and I think that at the time, probably 19, I published an article called "The One Force Moving the Stock Prices and What It Tells Us About the Future," and it took me my whole career to work this one out. And that is that the far and away, the most powerful force determining the walk of the stock markets is the central bank, is the Federal Reserve Bank, and whether it's engaged in quantitative easing or whether it's engaged in quantitative tightening. If it eases, stock markets go up. If it tightens, stock markets go down. And my prediction was that as this crisis advances, that they will have no choice but to flood the system with liquidity, and that most of this liquidity will always end up gravitating into the equity markets. The downside of the situation is that we get consumer price inflation, because inevitably some of that liquidity is going to be spilling over into the into the consumer markets. And so what we get is a typical syndrome of these crises that are that originate from the overhang of unpayable debts, that you end up with economic stagnation, rising inflation, and continuing inflation of asset bubbles. Unfortunately for investors, usually the inflation, the price inflation, meaning the collapse of the purchasing power of the currency, outstrips the gains from the stock market rise by a good chunk. And so through inflationary period, investors lose north of 50% of their of their wealth in real terms, and sometimes it approaches 100%. There's a complete wipeout. Now, dealing with let's talk for a minute about these unpayable debts. The public debt in the United States is $37 trillion, but that's not all of it, because there's state and local governments. And then you also have private debts, households, corporations, financial services organizations, and so forth. And so if you put that all together, that's a category that used to be called credit market debt. They changed that, but basically you arrive at something close to $110, $115 trillion, which works out to about $300,000 per man, woman, and child living in the United States. So an impossible situation. And then if you wanted to divide that by a household or by a taxpayer, somebody who actually makes a living, you go north of $500,000 per person. It's never going to be paid back. The only way that these debts can be serviced is by the banking system printing the money, quote unquote, and flooding it into the system in order to plug up the bad debts on the bank's balance sheets. Because if they didn't, you'd have run on banks. You get banking collapse, and usually, when you get a run on one bank, you have a domino effect that you're going to have the run on many banks, and then suddenly the liquidity vanishes from the system. There's rapid credit curtailment, mass bankruptcies, and huge unemployment, and then you have a very bad political crisis and potential revolution on your hands. So to avoid that, you just keep printing money, spending it on whatever, so that it circulates, and then a lot of it ends up going into the stock markets. So I think that this is what the United States is going to do, like the European Union, like the British, like Japan, like all nations always resort to this. Not always. Sometimes they go for savage austerity and rapid deleveraging, but that then creates depressions and unemployments and so forth. Now, where the United States has all kinds of other maneuvering space is with all this Trump's foreign policy activity, which, you see, he goes to different countries. He went to the Middle East. He got something like $1.4 trillion worth of investment from American Arab allies. So the overhang of unpayable debts can be resolved also by means of either increasing productivity in the system or bringing in new wealth. And so now it's clear that this is what Trump's trying to do. So he goes everywhere and he gets investment commitments to invest in the United States. When he summoned Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, to his golf course in Scotland, he got her to commit for European Union to invest $650 billion in the United States and purchase further several undisclosed hundreds of billions worth of American weapons. I'm pretty convinced that the estimated $230 billion of Russia's frozen assets that are currently frozen predominantly in European countries, that all of that is going to be transferred to the United States, and that the Russians are going to invest that in the American economy. That's why. That's a pretty obvious thing for Trump to do, and I think that if the U.S. Russian relationships continue along this path of constructive cooperation, that is just a matter of time when the Russians are going to issue an order to the UK, to the EC, European community, to the European Union, and to whatever other countries have Russian assets, to transfer those to the Federal Reserve in the United States. And, they might like to say, oh, no, your orders have no power here. So the assets stay where they are. When they receive the call from the Donald, then they're going to have to transfer them. And I think
we all saw the picture of them sitting outside waiting in the Oval Office and
yes,
sitting like school children. I mean, good gosh.
Yeah, like they were at the principal's office.
I mean, a picture speaks, a million words on that one. But
yeah, and the body language was just very embarrassing.
Yeah, no, that's definitely things you pay attention to that no one will talk about. So last thing real quick on this, because I know we're about out of time, but Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, he alluded to kind of what you've been talking about, which is bringing back, and this is my words, but the middle class, the industrialization. This is where all these tariffs fit in, bringing, manufacturing power back to the U.S. To help close that wealth gap, which is a big source of social problems, I think, everywhere, obviously, for all the reasons you talked about. Who benefits from, the QE? It's all the people that already have money. They can invest more, and it just, it splits. And he talked about possibly, he alluded to reviewing the role of the Fed on all levels, staffing, research, the overuse, and this is my words, but effectively the overuse of certain tools like QE and their role in monetary policy. And so I wonder if somehow there's a connection between what you're talking about and just how, there may be some kind of overhaul here, because it's clear, and again, these are words that, this is interpreting his comments, that they're not really as concerned with Wall Street as they are with Main Street, which speaks to what you said earlier. I don't know. Any final thoughts just on that kind of angle?
Yes, absolutely. Emerson, you're right. This is absolutely related, because these are the exact imbalances that the government has to address. But I think at this stage, changing a little bit the way Fed does things, and maybe introducing some regulation or policy change is just the work of gaining time and maneuvering space. I think that ultimately you're going to have to conduct a thorough overhaul of the whole monetary system. It cannot continue on the basis that it's set on, because it's the definition of unsustainable. I mentioned a minute ago, the total credit market debt, which reaches something north of $110 trillion today, I think. The monetary base is, I think, around $6 trillion. The monetary base is all the money in the system that's available for repayment of debts. So the size of the debts in the system is almost 20 times the size of the monetary base that's available for repayment of those debts. That's just a system that is in free fall, that seems to be fine until impact. And so, this generally unfolds as a slow motion train wreck, and people feel it in loss of prosperity, slowly declining standards of living, decaying infrastructure. And all these things that we observe every day. And if you look at U.S. cities with all the homeless people and all the drug addicts, people who have completely lost their place in society, these are manifestations of all that, but they're not going to be resolved until you completely change the monetary system. And then once you have a different monetary system in place, to change the economic policy. And what you need to do is you have to reform banking entirely, maybe even get rid of the Federal Reserve, but central bank can be useful to have. And then you need to create the even how do you call it, the level grounds for small local and regional banks to provide stable source of funding for small and medium-sized companies, for entrepreneurs, for mom and pop businesses who, in a generation will be the leading innovators. And in all market economies across the world, small and medium-sized businesses is exactly the engine of economic development that creates something around 70% of all jobs, the high-paying jobs. They're the engine of innovation. They're the engine of productivity growth and so forth. And you're not going to have it if the whole country is run by 5 or 6 mega banks who only deal with, GE and Lockheed Martin and ExxonMobil and Royal Dutch Shell or whatever. You need a banking system that supports the grassroots economic growth from individual entrepreneurs and families and so forth. And until you have that, all you're doing is you're gaining yourself maneuvering space and time.
That's actually what you just said is a good point, and that was part of the extended comments that Bassam made, which was the struggles that the importance of the small and mid-sized companies and the struggles in the current environment with credit, particularly because they rely on shorter-term loans, more subject to interest rate volatility, and and for a variety of different reasons. And so that is a focus. But I think the good takeaway, and I appreciate it, you've repeated it a few times, is that, or just you've been concluding this, is that this change doesn't happen overnight.
No.
And I think there's an element of people here that Trump supporters that were expecting this just. As soon as he's in office, people are going to get arrested. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. And that isn't realistic at all. And so I think it's like you said, you got to look at what's going on and see these different events that do not get any run in the press, or any significant run, but are actually, as you mentioned, the meeting in Alaska, those are huge policy shifts. And it's very, very significant to a better future. So, Alex, man, it's always good to see you. I always appreciate these conversations. I just feel like it's relevant and important, and your views are always appreciated, particularly because of just your personal background and the exposure you've had and a lot of different things that, guys like me who just grew up in Southern California, and done a little traveling, but haven't lived anywhere and been educated anywhere outside of the U.S. It's appreciated. So just thanks for coming on and for your time tonight on Upthinking Finance.
Thank you for having me, Emerson, and I look forward to the next time.
Awesome. Thank you.
Take care.
Emerson Fersch is a registered representative with and securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA, SIPC. Advisor services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from Capital Investment Advisors. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. The guest speakers and the companies they represent are not affiliated with or endorsed by LPL Financial or Capital Investment Advisors. Individual tax and legal matters should be discussed with your tax or legal expert. Economic forecasts set forth may not develop as predicted, and there can be no guarantee that strategies promoted will be successful. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. There is no assurance that the techniques and strategies discussed are suitable for all investors or will yield positive outcomes. The purchase of certain securities may be required to affect some of the strategies. Investing involves risks, including possible loss of principal.